6 decisions. 6 moments where someone in power made a choice. And that choice didn't just change history, it shattered it. We talk a lot about the deadliest wars in history. We count the casualties, we name the battles, we remember the generals. But almost nobody asks the real question: what actually started it? Not the official story, not the textbook answer. The actual decision, the one made in a room by a person under pressure that lit the fuse. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at war the same way again. Let's start with a decision so catastrophic, so staggeringly miscalculated, that historians are still arguing about it more than a century later. It's the summer of 1914. Europe is a powder keg. Everyone knows it. The alliances are tangled, the empires are nervous, and the military planners have been drafting war scenarios for decades. And then Archduke Franz Ferdinand is shot in Sarajevo. A tragedy, yes. But here's what most people completely miss: that assassination did not have to become a world war. It almost didn't. For nearly a month after the shooting, diplomats scrambled. Letters were exchanged, ultimatums were drafted and debated. And then Austria-Hungary made its decision. It issued an ultimatum to Serbia, so deliberately humiliating, so designed to be rejected, that war became the only possible outcome. Serbia actually accepted almost every single condition. Almost. And Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. Why? Because certain officials in Vienna had already decided this was their moment. They genuinely believed, that a quick, contained regional war would actually strengthen the empire. They thought Germany would back them, Russia would back down, and the whole thing would be over in weeks. Every single assumption was wrong. That one decision, Austria-Hungary's deliberate choice to escalate rather than negotiate, triggered the alliance system like falling dominoes. Within 6 weeks, most of Europe was at war. By the time it ended, over 17 million people were dead. The Austro-Hungarian Empire itself would cease to exist. The decision meant to save the empire destroyed it entirely. And that's actually what makes the next part so important, because Austria-Hungary wasn't acting alone. And the man who gave them the green light made an equally catastrophic miscalculation. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany met with Austro-Hungarian officials on July 5, 1914, and gave what historians now call the blank check. Germany would fully support Austria-Hungary no matter what they decided. Wilhelm genuinely believed this show of strength would deter Russia from intervening. He thought it was a chess move. It was actually checkmate against himself. Here's the thing: nobody talks about Wilhelm, then went on vacation. He boarded his yacht, he sailed away. While the most dangerous diplomatic crisis in European history was unfolding, the man who had just handed out unconditional military support left for a holiday cruise. His military and diplomatic staff began making decisions independently. By the time he returned, the machinery of war was already running, and no one had the power or perhaps the will to stop it. The blank check is one of the most reckless decisions in the history of modern warfare. Not because Wilhelm wanted a world war, he almost certainly didn't, but because he made an enormous, irreversible commitment without thinking through the consequences. Confidence without calculation is one of the most dangerous things a leader can possess. But here's what most people completely miss when they think about how wars truly begin. Sometimes it's not overconfidence that starts the fire. Sometimes it's fear. Jump forward to 1941. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, is already underway. Japan, Germany's ally, is watching events unfold. And in Tokyo, a group of military leaders are sitting in a room making a decision that will define the Pacific War. Japan had been expanding aggressively across Asia for years. The United States had responded with economic pressure, cutting off oil exports, freezing Japanese assets. For a country that imported over 80% of its oil, this was existential. Japan had roughly 18 months of oil reserves. After that, its military machine would simply stop. So the decision: do you negotiate, withdraw from some of your conquests, and preserve peace with America? Or do you strike first, seize the oil fields in Southeast Asia, and try to win the war before the United States can fully mobilize? Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, reportedly told Japanese leaders before the decision was made, "I can run wild for 6 months, or perhaps a year, but I have absolutely no confidence for the second and third years." He wasn't enthusiastic. He was warning them, and they proceeded anyway. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 united American public opinion overnight. A nation that had been deeply divided about entering the war was suddenly unanimously furious. Japan's decision to strike didn't neutralize America, it awakened it. Within 4 years, Japan had suffered 2 atomic bombings and total defeat. The fear of running out of oil led to a war that consumed the entire Pacific. Now here's where it gets interesting, because not every catastrophic decision comes from the top. Some of the worst decisions in military history were made by mid-level commanders who had just enough authority to cause disaster and not enough wisdom to recognize it. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. But one of its turning points came from a decision that American commanders on the ground made in late 1950, when UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur pushed deep into North Korea, approaching the Chinese border at the Yalu River. Beijing had sent clear, repeated diplomatic signals that it would not tolerate foreign forces approaching its border. China's foreign minister had stated it publicly. Indian diplomatic back channels were carrying the same message. American intelligence was reporting Chinese troop buildups. MacArthur dismissed it. He publicly stated that China would not intervene. He divided his forces. He pushed forward. And then in late November 1950, approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River and struck. It was one of the largest military surprises in American history. UN forces were pushed back hundreds of miles. The war, which had seemed nearly over, would grind on for 3 more years and cost tens of thousands of additional lives. MacArthur's decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It was made in a fog of arrogance, the belief that the enemy would do what he assumed, not what they had actually told him they would do. There is a lesson buried inside that decision that applies far beyond the battlefield. Never confuse your assumptions about an enemy with your knowledge of them. But that's not the crazy part, because sometimes the decision that starts a war isn't made by a general or a king or an emperor. Sometimes it's made by an accident, and then it's made worse by someone who refuses to admit it. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 is one of the most consequential misreadings of information in American history. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese torpedo boats did attack the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. That part is real. But 2 days later, on August 4th, American sailors reported a second attack. The problem, that second attack almost certainly never happened. Bad weather radar malfunctions and jumpy sailors reporting phantom contacts in the dark. Here's the critical moment. Within hours, signals intelligence analysts were already casting doubt on the second attack. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara received these doubts. President Lyndon Johnson was told there was uncertainty. And yet the decision was made to present the second attack to Congress as fact. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed almost unanimously, giving the president broad authorization to escalate military involvement in Vietnam. Johnson later reportedly told an aide about those August 4th reports, "Hell, those dumb, stupid sailors were just shooting at flying fish." He knew the evidence was shaky, and the escalation happened anyway. Over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese would die in the conflict that followed. All of it authorized by an incident that one of its key architects privately doubted was real. That is the weight of a decision made in haste under political pressure when the human cost seems abstract and distant. And the final decision on this list brings us to one that unfolded not over days or weeks, but over years. And unlike the others, it wasn't a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of choices, each one reasonable sounding in isolation, each one catastrophic in its cumulative effect. The lead up to World War II is often framed as Hitler's aggression versus the world's reluctance to act. But the Western policy of appeasement, particularly the 1938 Munich Agreement, where Britain and France allowed Nazi Germany to annex Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, represents a decision-making failure of historic magnitude. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich holding a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time. He genuinely believed it. He was not a coward, and he was not foolish. He was a man who had lived through the devastation of World War I and was desperate to prevent another. But his decision to appease Hitler was built on a fundamentally wrong assumption that Hitler's demands were limited. That satisfying one territorial claim would satisfy the appetite. 6 months after Munich, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. 6 months after that, it invaded Poland. World War II had begun. Approximately 70 to 85 million people would die before it ended, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. What makes Munich so haunting is not that the decision was made by a monster. It was made by a decent man with the best intentions who believed that giving ground was smarter than risking war. He was right that war was horrific. He was catastrophically wrong about who he was negotiating with. Most people believe that wars are started by obvious villains making obviously terrible choices. But the truth is far more unsettling. Wars are started by humans, some arrogant, some fearful, some well-intentioned, who misread the moment, misjudged their enemy, or simply refuse to hear what they don't want to hear. The blank check given in confidence, the attack launched out of fear, the warning dismissed as bluff, the doubt buried beneath political convenience, the concession made in hope. These are the decisions that built the deadliest wars in history. Not in textbooks, in rooms, by people. So here's what it comes down to. Across 6 of the worst wars in human history, the common thread isn't evil. It's misjudgment, arrogance, fear, wishful thinking, and the refusal to hear inconvenient truths. That's what makes these moments so haunting. They were preventable. Every single one of them carried a moment where a different choice was possible. Which of these decisions do you think was the most avoidable, and what would have had to change for history to go differently? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. If this kind of deep dive into the real decisions behind history is what you've been looking for, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a new video. This is Eclipse History, and I'll see you in the next one.